Welcome to the Health, Vengeance and Harmonies podcast. I'm Leonardo Muller-Rodriguez, a PhD student exploring the intersections between neuroscience, music therapy and sleep. Before I introduce my lovely guest, Emily, I want to give a bit of background on the podcast inspiration, which is that of mimetic desire, a concept by René Girard, which, Emily, you're not familiar with yet, but you will in a few seconds. It is that human desire is shaped by imitation. And this is suggested to be a guiding emotions for social interactions. And on the positive side, there is compassionate, empathetic, and healing behaviors towards those who are similar to us. Whereas on the negative side, there is rivalry, scapegoating, and disconnection towards those who are similar. And this concept could come in handy when speaking about your research, Emily, because you speak about synchronization a lot in the context of music. Yeah. So today I'm joined with Emily Wood, a fifth year PhD student at the LiveLab, the McMaster University LiveLab in Ontario, where she investigates how audiences interact with performances using motion capture, physiological recordings, and behavior annotations. And you have a background in jazz, piano, and psychology, which brings a unique lens to studying music as a science. How else would you describe yourself?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I am a musician turned researcher, I suppose, and quite nerdy about all things music science and neuroscience, and just ultimately fascinated by music and how it's found in cultures all across the world and is so important for human beings and is such an old behavior we have. I'm just so interested and fascinated by it.
It's definitely a fascinating field of research. And as you mentioned, you started off as a pianist, and here you have your Instagram if people want to follow you. You play once in a while, you have gigs here, but also you blend your playing with research from the LiveLab. For instance, here we're going to talk about this research you did, motion capture with hip hop dancers. And here's another example. You were at the Smart Lab. And now you are at the Auditory Development Lab. Tell me a bit about your journey. What inspired you to start to be a musician and then to do research about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we kind of jumped throughout my journey there. So I actually started off, I did my first degree in jazz piano performance at McGill University. So I started off in a music degree, actually, then my first journey into academia. And I really enjoyed it so much. I got to spend 4 years of my life just practicing and getting as good as possible at music. And music school really transformed the way I interacted with sound. Like all of a sudden I started hearing things differently as a result of like just being immersed in jazz all the time. I didn't really play that much jazz before university. So like I learned so much. I learned as much from my peers as I did from like my profs. That was very cool. However, at the end of jazz school, I kind of came to the conclusion that, I don't want to be like a performing jazz musician is not really what I want for my career. But I know that music is the most important thing to me in my life, and I want a career focused on music, just not like as a jazz musician. So I was kind of, thinking about options, and I was interested in music therapy. So I started taking some psychology courses at, it was called Ryerson University at the time. Now it's called Toronto Metropolitan University. So I started taking some psychology courses, and that's where I met, I heard about Frank Russo, who was a music cognition researcher at that university. And I'd never even heard about like music psychology research before. I didn't even know that was a possibility. So I heard about that. I got super excited, and I started working in his lab as a research assistant. Yeah, so there's Frank. And with Frank, I started working on one of his projects, looking at how choir training can change older adults' auditory perception abilities. So I started working on that project, and I worked on that for several years with him. And I ended up actually getting a second undergrad degree in psychology there. And that was a interesting time in my life. I didn't think I would get another undergraduate degree, but I actually just ended up loving it so much that I stuck around and did it. I also was a piano teacher at the time. I had like 50 piano students a week on top
Wow.
of working in the lab, on top of getting this second degree. I was hustling at this time.
Yeah.
Um, but after going through that, I found out that I really, really loved the research. And then at that point, I had my eyes on the LiveLab at McMaster University and Laurel Trainer, because I've heard of her research. She's done so many cool studies, especially with infants in music, but also with her really cool research in the LiveLab looking at actual musical performance and like nonverbal communication. I thought it was so cool, and you know what? I was like, I want to go do my PhD there. So that's where I ended up, and I've been there ever since.
This is your representation of there ever since. No.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Fantastic.
That's
That's
right.
a
It's
very, very interesting journey that you have. A student for life. A student for
yes,
life.
that's that's for sure. I just love university so much. I never want to leave.
That's fantastic, Emily. Um, and you touched upon this research that you did with aging and singing in a choir, and how it improves auditory capacity and skill in aging. And maybe we can start with that because that's where you started your research journey. And I'm just bringing up this graph, which seems to be quite interesting for this discussion. It's showing how well the brain activity is matching a speech task, so the sounds of words. And the choir singing improves a lot with the choir training. Do you want to touch on this research? What was fascinating about
Sure.
it?
Yeah, so in that study, we had a group of older adults go through 10 weeks of choir training, and then that we were comparing that to a control group. And that graph is looking at the strength of how well your brain is encoding a certain pitch that we're playing. And we found that after the choir training, the older adults' brain was more faithfully encoding that pitch. So that was super interesting to us, and we thought that maybe when you learn how to sing, you're really training your brain to really listen to these really, really small changes in pitch and really get attuned into timing. Um, so we're thinking that going through this choral training can actually be beneficial for the brain, and it's showing these effects on how it's actually processing speech afterwards, which was a really cool finding.
Definitely very inspiring for singing all life. I've just
Yes.
been fascinated recently with the song lines of Aboriginal culture. Are you familiar with it?
Oh,
No.
no, but that
Well,
sounds fascinating.
it is quite interesting. It's really important for their learning and knowledge is through singing and dancing.
Mm.
So, but many cultures sing a lot. So the point being that singing is a must for a healthy brain throughout life.
Mhm.
Fantastic. And so your research focuses on how does an audience affect a performer? Is that correct? Is that the
Yes, that's one line of research that I'm really interested in.
how many lines of
So
research? Yeah, go on.
I have a couple. Yes, I'm
Cool.
interested in a lot of things, but yeah, so as a musician myself, I've always been so interested in how do we play differently when we're playing in front of other people compared to, when you're by yourself. You talk to any performing musician and they'll say, "Oh, there's something different when I'm in a real life performance. Like there's something special about having people there, and it actually affects how I play. Like I feel the energy of the audience, and then I can put that into my performance and reflect it right back. And I just think that's so interesting because it's like not only is the audience there to watch you play, but they're actually affecting the performer as well. It's like this bi-directional interaction that is going on. Which I just find so interesting. So when I'm here in the Live Lab, we're having concerts here in the. I should probably tell everyone a little bit more about what the Live Lab is first.
Yes.
So this is a lab we have at McMaster University. It's a performance hall, but not just any performance hall. It's also a science lab. So it's 106 seats. And it's equipped with all sorts of technology. For instance, we can record EEG in up to 30 audience members as they're watching a real live performance. It's equipped with a motion capture system, so there's about 30 cameras all around the hall, so we can capture how musicians are moving in really great detail as they're performing, as well as audience members. We can look at how audience members move as they play.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually use the motion capture this system the most for my research. There's also physiology, so like we can record heart rates, breathing rates, skin responses in audience members during performances. So we can really like study in great detail like how people are responding or reacting in real time during performances. And the really special thing is not only can we do this in many people all at the same time, which is like super special, but we can also do it in like a real performance hall. So like this is in a very naturalistic setting. So there's something really special about that.
It's really cool. Yeah.
It is very cool.
Do- mhm.
I use the motion capture system the most for my research. Um, yeah, there's many
Like this
projects
one.
that,
Yeah.
yes, like this one, this is showing a mime. So we motion captured this mime actually about a month ago in the Live Lab, um, and to see how he moves during his performances. And then this was actually part of the study that we were talking about how audiences affect performers. So
Mm.
just going back to that question, so I'm
Yeah.
really interested in how, yeah, audiences and performers interact and how audiences can actually affect the delivery of a performance. So since we're in the live lab and since we're having these concerts going on, what we do is we just we record the performances without an audience present, so at like a dress rehearsal, and then we record the performances during the actual concert. So we can like motion capture the performers in a dress rehearsal and then compare their movements to when they actually do the actual performance, which is so cool to be collecting this data during like a real performance. It's very cool data. So
100%. Yeah.
yeah, so we have collected that data for quite a few concerts now. So we've collected it for um, an amazing classical piano player. That was kind of the first time I collected that data. And then since then, it's been quite a while since then, but we've now done a couple follow-up data sets. So I've collected it from that Mime performance as
Hmm.
well, which is very cool.
Cool.
We've done it in hip hop
Mm.
dancers now during a hip hop competition. And most recently, we collected it for a group of indigenous dancers, which was
Oh.
super amazing.
Mm.
So, slowly collecting these data sets so we can start to accumulate um, data sets and like be able to compare across different types of groups.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And you've mentioned that you already see a difference between the interaction between performer and the audience, depending on the creative discipline or the style of the art. Can you compare between hip hop, classical music, even indigenous performers?
Yeah, so all this data is still ongoing. Analysis is still ongoing. Uh, the one data set that's really completed the analysis is the one of the classical piano player. And that's kind of where I started. And when I first started doing this research on, how do audiences affect the performer, I thought right away that, oh yes, the audience is going to totally affect the performer. The performer is going to be more intense during the concert. They're going to be more exaggerated. They're going to be, yeah, have more energy in their movements. I thought for sure we're going to see this. And then I started off with this classical piano player, recorded the data, and I analyzed the data. And the first thing I noticed right away is that, oh, I'm actually seeing that this classical piano player is playing remarkably consistent when there's an audience there or not. She's playing almost exactly the same. There was like barely any differences in her movements. And I was like, that's not what I thought would happen. I was totally surprised. I was like, how could it be? And then I thought about it more and I realized that, you know what? It actually makes sense how consistent this piano player is because um, she had practiced these pieces extensively and she had decided exactly how she wanted to play them. And she would play them exactly the same every time. And then I thought about the audience during these performances. And in classical music, the conventions are kind of to not interact with the performer. You're quite quiet in a
Yeah.
classical performance. You are just sitting there listening. I mean, you applaud at the end, but you are not interacting with the performer in real time. You're not cheering during the
Mhm.
performance. You're staying quite silent.
Mhm.
Now, in that data set, we did find that there was slight exaggerations. Like there was a little bit higher variability in how she moved and like in her timing when the audience was there. So there was evidence for like a slight exaggeration, but it was just like ever so slight. It was so small. And then that's when I got thinking, I was like, you know what? If I am looking scientifically at how audiences affect performers, looking in like there's so many types of music all over the world and there's so many different ways audiences interact with performers and in the conventions of classical music the amount of interaction is actually quite small. And if you look at other genres, like if you just look in jazz, like people like cheer after solos and they like make
Mhm.
noise but they like what they're hearing. And then and like I went into this hip hop world, and this was in collaboration with my colleague and a PhD student in my lab, Chantal Carrillo. She's an amazing hip hop dancer, and that's kind of how I got
Okay.
brought into that work.
Nice.
I started seeing the hip hop shows, and the audiences are not quiet during these shows. They are cheering. They will let you know if they like what you are doing. And that's like part of the culture. It's like normal
Mm.
for audiences to do that. And then that's why I thought, okay, it's really the amount that the audience is going to actually affect the performance. It's actually going to matter how the degree to which the audience is actually interacting with the performer.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, okay, you know what? I need to update my predictions here. This is what happens in classic science. You will run one experiment and don't get the results that you thought, and then it makes you think a little deeper about it, and you realize that your initial hypothesis had to be a little bit more nuanced, and that's
Mhm.
exactly what happened with that first experiment I did. And now, as we're going on and collecting more data sets, yeah, we're excited to look at differences in those cases. So, like I said, we've now collected this data from a group of hip hop dancers. I have not actually analyzed that part of the data yet, but we've collected in the Mime and in the indigenous dancers, and we actually only just did that like in the last couple of weeks. We
All right.
collected that data, so that's brand new.
Nice.
So I am just in process of data analysis now, but yeah, it'll be cool to have
Great.
this kind of series of case studies looking
Yeah.
at a bunch of different performers and looking at how these changes occur in these different settings.
Oh, that's fascinating. And the classical musician, I'm sure you thought that could be thought as a control for these cases, the control case, because it's the least interaction, the audience interaction spectrum or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And it made me think of even between movements of classical music, there's just silence. You don't clap between the end of a
Exactly.
within the
And
parts.
like, yeah, I always thought that was quite bizarre. That felt weird to me. But like, it's just the culture. Like
Yeah,
that is what is typical. That's what's normal. You want to not disturb the performer. You're there to witness them do this like amazing performance, and I think the audience is like, let them be in their zone. Let's not disturb them. And
yeah,
that's just speaking to we're letting the performer do their thing, and we don't want to actually interact with that process. It's so interesting.
definitely. That's amazing. I'm going to a hip hop breaking convention in 2 weeks, so
Oh, very
I'm gonna
cool.
get to experience that audience interaction. I'll think about it.
Yes, it's
Yeah,
so much fun. The energy is so great. Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, and do you use any additional data, like physiological data? Because you've mentioned there's so many things you can record in addition to the motion capture. Are you looking at other ones as well?
Yeah, well, a lot of these studies on the performers, like we've also recorded data from the audience as well. So in the case of that classical piano player, we actually recorded EEG um, in 20 audience members and their heart rates during
Hmm.
that performance, which was so cool. I think you have a picture of that of the poster there. Um,
Yes.
so that was cool. So we can actually see how the audience is actually reacting to the performance. Um, so some of my colleagues are working on this data.
Awesome.
So they're looking at specific moments in the performance and like looking at how the audience is all reacting together. And I think they're following up the study now by getting actual ratings of the performance. So they're having
Hmm.
people rate the performance for
Cool.
maybe it's valence and arousal, and then they're relating the EEG activity to the ratings.
Hmm.
So that is also in progress as well. That's just an
Fantastic.
example of what some of the data looks like.
Very cool. Yeah, so you're asking about emotional self-reports, like the valence
Yes.
and the arousal.
Hmm.
Very good. I'm guessing that's they're watching the filmed, recorded performance and the annotating, or is it just from memory?
For the ratings, I think
Yeah.
it's only audio. They're listening to audio
Okay.
from the
That's fine.
performances
Yeah.
to do that. Yes, yeah.
That's good.
But also in some of the other studies, we also have eye tracking data. Like so for the
Oh,
mime performance, the
hmm.
audiences, we recorded their heart rate, so physiology, but also their eye gaze.
Very
So we could
nice.
see
Very
what
interesting.
people are focusing on during performance. So we could see, okay, what are people paying attention to? Like what is important for the audience? So we can answer questions like that.
Very nice. It's going to be fascinating, the results.
Yeah.
Such an
Mhm.
interesting lab that you're working in.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. It was
And
very cool. I really love working there. Yeah.
that's very good. Yeah, I can tell it's worth it.
Mhm.
Um, the speaking about the audience interaction, um, this hip hop study was actually part of a competition, you said, and you looked at how the ratings between the audience, so the ratings of the hip hop performance, what was triggering the enjoyment of the audience versus expert judges who were
Mhm.
judging, and in essence, the audience ratings showed a strong correlation between the movements, rhythmicity, and synchronicity with the musical rhythms, whereas a judge, not as much. Could
Yes,
you?
that was cool. So the hip hop study, it was a competition. There were how many groups? I think, 6 or 7 hip hop groups competing. They
Oh,
each did like about a 2-minute piece, and we had some expert judges judging each piece, and we had the audience watching, and the audience also did like judged who was their favorite as well. Um, and we motion captured the all of the groups. So we were really interested in with the motion capture was how um, synchronous their movements were. So this was run by
hmm.
Chantel Carrillo in my lab. She was interested in, is it the synchrony between the hip hop dancers' movements, which is going to predict who is the winner of this competition?
Hmm.
Is that the factor that really matters? So motion captured them. We did an analysis to see like how in sync they were. Um, and then the really interesting thing was that the synchrony of the dancer's movement did predict the audience choice of the winner. So it's almost like the synchrony really mattered to the audience. If the audience is watching, the synchrony of the dancers is what's going to sway them to like who is the winner of the competition. However, it was not true for the judges. The judges were not. That was not the factor that determined how the judges decided who was the winner. So that just indicates that the judges are looking at something else, maybe something more technical, maybe something more on a high level. But for the audience, the synchrony was very important. So that was super interesting.
Oh, interesting. So it's more about how the dancers are in sync rather than in sync with the music.
Oh,
That's
that is
it.
a whole other question. I
Yeah.
think we only looked at how in sync they were with each other.
Mhm. Mm.
But they were all dancing to a piece of music. Yes.
That's very, very interesting. And because here the focus really is about synchrony between
Yes.
performers, this is a nice segue to this other study about how musical ensembles learn unfamiliar music, and through the process of learning, they use body language to signal different things at different stages of the learning process.
Hmm.
Um, so this is about group coordination in musical ensembles. Is there similarity, do you think, between hip hop dancers' synchrony and group coordination here of musical
Well,
ensembles?
yeah. Well, it's just how important movements are and um, how they support the group. So in here, the other really cool thing we can do with the motion capture system is that we can look at nonverbal communication that's going on in groups together. So in this case of the ensemble that you mentioned, we do a really cool technique with our motion capture to look at nonverbal communication. So we've done things like bring in like small groups, like a string quartet. String quartets are really interesting because it's a small group. They're all able to all look at each other and all communicate with each other. There's no like conductor, so they're like managing the leadership like within the group together. And all string quartets are different. Like some string quartets, like I'm sure maybe the violin one is the clear leader. Some might be more egalitarian, but it's a very kind of perfect little model to look at like how they communicate together. So what we do is we motion capture all the musicians in an ensemble. You can see in that picture that's shown on the screen, like we're capturing the body sway of each group member here, so we can like measure how violin one is moving they're like swaying their body as they play, and we can do the same with violin two and the viola and the cello. So basically, what the motion capture gives us is a time series that represents the body sway of each one of these musicians. And then what we do is this mathematical analysis that pretty much allows us to tell how these musicians are influencing each other. So if we're interested in how, let's say, violin one is moving their body at a specific point in time in the music, we can predict how they are moving their body from their own past time series, or we could see how they are moving based on a prediction from another musician, say violin two. And if the information in the body sway of violin two can predict the current state of violin one over and above any prediction within violin one itself, then we say there is like a transfer of information from one musician to the other. That one musician is adding new information to the signal of the other musician. And that's what we take as a measure of like nonverbal communication going on
Mm.
in the group. So that's basically what we do in our lab. We've used this technique in several studies in the lab, looking at nonverbal communication in small groups. And in this study that you're showing here, I think is a really cool study. In this study, we were really interested in, how do groups of musicians learn new pieces together? You mentioned that. So when we get
Mm.
a new piece together, especially if it's an expressive piece with a lot of like, ebbs and flows in the piece with like the tempo moves dynamically and expressively. And when you have like a score, like you get a score that tells you what notes to play, it tells you what to play, but a score doesn't tell you how to play it. And there's actually so much nuance there in like exactly how you interpret
Mm.
some of these very expressive moments in a piece. So that's what we were interested in. How does a group learn how to do this together? So what we did is we gave them a couple very expressive new pieces they had never heard together, and we just asked them to play it together 8 times in a row. And we motion captured them while they do this, and we were just interested in like what changes in the nonverbal communication from when the piece is most unfamiliar compared to 8 trials later when they have effectively learned the piece together. What's different?
Mm.
So that's exactly what we did. We motion captured them, and we did this analysis of nonverbal communication, and it was actually a very cool finding. So when the piece is most unfamiliar, we found that they're actually communicating more with each other. So there's more of these interactions in their body sway signals where they are predicting each other when the piece is most unfamiliar.
Mm-hmm.
However, by the time they learn the piece, this nonverbal communication actually decreases in their group. They're not communicating with each other as much. So we kind of see like a drop off in the nonverbal communication with learning, which is kind of interesting. And it makes sense because when the piece is most unfamiliar, you don't know how your group members are going to play the piece. You don't know exactly how they're going to slow down at a phrase ending. You don't know how they're going to shape the dynamics of a certain phrase. So you kind of have to be looking to each other and communicating with your body sway, like how you are playing. And that information in the body sway can help you coordinate together. Now, as you learn the piece together, you actually start to learn, oh, these are what my fellow musicians are going to do. And you
Mm.
actually don't need to rely on these signals from body sway as much because you've learned a representation of how your group members are going to play, and now you don't need to rely on the signals from body sway as much. And that's why we see this drop off in nonverbal communication as they
Interesting.
learn, which was super cool. It's like they come to a joint interpretation together that they have learned. Now, the other thing I should note is that as this nonverbal communication decreased with learning, the synchronicity of their body sway actually got more similar as they learned the pieces as well. Uh, so we kind of had this drop off in nonverbal communication and this kind of rise in synchronicity of their body movement. So that's kind of
That's
interesting. It's
amazing.
almost like as this joint interpretation, they come to this joint interpretation of how they play this piece, they just become all more synchronous together,
Hmm.
which was so cool. Mhm.
Very, very interesting. So there's that need to make use of nonverbal communication while you're trying to do other stuff. You can't be speaking as well. They might stop, but to make it more effective, they can make use
Mhm.
of body sways until it just becomes ingrained in everyone's understanding of the structure of the piece, and everyone synchronizes. It's a very, very
Exactly.
interesting finding. Yeah,
Yes, it was very cool. Yeah.
very, very nice. No, that was a dense a study, but very important to understand also how you measured it. I think you described a mathematical method called the Granger causality, which
Yes,
allows you to
that's the name.
compare different influences on time series.
Mhm.
Um, and that's very nice. And talking about the learning process, you have a background in jazz,
That's right.
and people would say uh, that you don't play pieces by heart in jazz. Obviously, you have to learn stuff when you're trying to be good at playing jazz. What's the what's your experience of learning and playing jazz in groups? And do you have any insights that you can compare to with your research, such as this group cohesion?
Yeah, I think that is super interesting. The process of learning how to do jazz improvisation, I think, is very fascinating, and I'm still I'm still very interested in it. So when I started jazz school, I actually had barely ever done any jazz improvisation. It was like, still quite new to me. So I got to jazz school and I was really, really focused on just like getting at to a level where I felt comfortable with the basic playing. And what I would do actually is what a lot of jazz musicians do is learn a lot of riffs in all 12 keys. So I would go find a Charlie Parker line that I really liked, and then I would learn it, and then I would like learn it in all 12 keys. And I would do that over and over again. Like I would go and find Wynton Kelly one I liked. I'd go find a Herbie Hancock one I liked, a Brad Mehldau lick I liked. I'd learn it all. Um, and I found that process quite fun. It was kind of
Nice.
technical, like all
Yeah.
12 keys. It was like a clear formula I could follow, and then I could insert these, and they would sound good. Um, However, I think at a certain point, I have reached a wall with that. Like you can only go so far with that kind of approach, um, because you're just at some point you have to be able to stop relying on pre-memorized motor patterns that you have practiced. If you want to truly improvise, you kind of have to let go of the cognitive part of it, let go of what you're thinking, and be able to like hear in your head, what do I hear over this chord progression that is just me, what I could like sing in my head. And I think if I could go back to my jazz journey, I didn't focus on that as much. I was so focused on these cool patterns and cool licks that maybe I overlooked the importance of just like simple, singable lines that I truly hear myself over a given
Mm.
chord
That's
pattern.
very poetic and very nice to describe it like that. That's very nice. To be able
Mm.
to sing, let yourself sing. But what
Yeah.
about chord sequences? Because how would you improvise to those? Would you learn traditional jazz pieces and know its structure or
Yeah, well,
not?
I would just learn like the typical standard tunes. So like there's some jazz standard songs, and it's those chord progressions that I would practice over. So like you know some famous ones like All the Things You Are, Stella by Starlight, those types of, and then there's like the blues, there's rhythm changes. So just like those
Hmm.
typical chord progressions. And then I guess as a piano player, I'm also like really interested in harmony as well. So I'm really interested in like the voicings over those tunes. So like, what are all the different
Hmm.
ways that I can voice E minor 7 chord, and like how do they all sound? How does it sound if I'm higher up on the piano? How does it sound in the middle? What kind of extensions sound good over those? I was also very fascinated by that as well. But
Amazing.
I will say that over jazz school, like I had a very cognitive approach to playing jazz. I was always analyzing things and like learning motor patterns and thinking as I'm playing, I'm like, I'm going to play this one here. And what I really think is that that kind of prevented me from being like fully embodied playing and kind of like letting it flow, I believe. And I really think that embodiment is like so important in jazz improvisation. If you're like thinking too hard about what you're doing, that kind of prevents you from being able to be in the moment and be able to kind of react in the moment in the way that is possible, I believe. So yeah, I think that is
Mm.
something really interesting
Definitely,
about jazz
definitely.
performance. Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, being in a flow states does come
Mhm.
with a lot of training. You've just mentioned all these uh, structuring of the chords so you can play them differently, and a bit of variation on how you play it. Copying the melodies of your favorite jazz musicians and playing them in different keys. So you have the motor patterns in all keys. And then you have learning all these standards. I mean, I just looked at how many there are, 750. There are lots of standards to
There's a
learn.
lot. Yeah.
Yeah. There might be some similarities, I guess, between maybe you can learn a few and you know the type of chord changes that you need. But here you touched on something very interesting. Now you have all this musical knowledge that you're practicing, but the most important is becoming embodied and into a flow state where you are reacting to what you're hearing, to what others musicians are saying, but also what you are saying. And it's yeah, do you know a bit about the process between switching from musical knowledge to embodiment?
Yeah, that is a great question. Um, and an elusive one. Getting from that place of being very cognitive and thinking about what you're playing and analyzing and being able to let go of that. I do think you have to reach a certain skill level before you are able to let go. Like you have to learn the vocabulary of jazz. You have to like know your theory. You have to know what works. You need to be able to hear in your head. But like once you have those fundamental skills, to kind of now stop thinking about them. Paradoxically, like stop
Mm.
thinking about what you're playing and just be in the moment and hear and trust that you know what you're doing and to kind of just let sing out what you hear in that moment. And yeah, so you
Mm.
mentioned a flow state, and that kind of is an embodiment of what a flow state is. There's actually
Mm.
some research on jazz improvisation that I find really fascinating. So what they've done is they've taken jazz piano players and they've put them in a brain scanner while they're improvising and like compare it to um, they compare when they're like improvising compared to when they're like playing like predetermined like licks that they've like figured out ahead of time. And the
Mm.
really cool thing is that when you're they were improvising, they actually showed deactivations in certain areas of the prefrontal cortex,
Mm.
which is actually very fascinating because if you think about improvisation, this seems like such a hard task. Like you have to pick what notes to play, you have to make sure they work in the context, you have to pick the harmonies, and you have to do this all on the fly in real time. There's no time for you to make a mistake. Like you're on to the next beat, like in the next moment. Wouldn't that require like more processing? Wouldn't that be harder? Yet we see kind of a deactivation in these kind of planning areas, which is just like so interesting. And like
It
I think
is.
the authors in that study kind of took that as an indication of being in a flow state. Like even though you're doing all these really complex things, you're not overly planning it. You're kind of just letting it happen.
Yeah. In a way, it's to reach a sort of easy mode state. That's kind of the flow. But obviously, there's a lot of practice before that, but
There's a lot of practice to be able to
yeah,
get to the place where you're actually able to do that, but
yeah.
I think that is kind of like the what we're aiming for. We're aiming to be able to be embodied in that moment and
Mm,
being able to just kind of let it happen in the moment.
that is very nice. I had read through a quick theory called the Vandervert model. I read it one time, but it seemed to match here the idea that this scientist is suggesting that we have what we're learning, it goes into the working memory, the executive cortex, and there's an interaction between how we see the world, and then when it gets thrown towards our cerebellum, um, then it becomes embodied, and you start using apparently the cerebellum to reactivate these memories that maybe all this musical knowledge starts to be embodied into the cerebellum. I don't know how
That's
much evidence
interesting.
this has, but it's a theory. So it seems
That's
to,
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
That's cool. And the study I was talking about was one by Charles Lim. I think it was a 2008 study on improvising jazz piano players is the one I was referring to. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Charles Lin.
Yes.
Okay, it might be this guy, yeah. He seems to have a
Yeah, yeah.
panel talk as well. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Maps
Yes.
creativity, your
He
brain on
came
improv.
to Yeah,
Hmm.
he came to McMaster one, I think it was back
Oh,
in 2017. Yeah, gave a great
fantastic.
talk. Yeah.
Great. Very interesting. So I also remember seeing one time that meditation also turns off the prefrontal cortex. I don't know, you mentioned there's a bit some specific brain regions that are turned off in those cases of
Yeah.
improvisation, but in general, also meditation seems to, in experts,
Hmm.
seems to turn that off.
That is
Um,
very interesting. I don't know much about meditation research, but I would say that, um, jazz musicians, when they are doing their craft, they are like meditating in their moment in a way. It's like I think the brain state of flow in music is probably similar to that of meditation.
so one last topic want to touch on with you is the difference in creativity between improvised music, like in jazz musicians, and let's say classical interpreters. In essence, there seems to be more possibilities that a improviser jazz musician can play around with compared to a classical musician. He has less, they have less levers to play around with. Um, Now, in their interpretation, because it's more based on the score, whereas in jazz musicians, they have all these elements that we've just discussed about chords and melodies that they can play around with. Um, so, what do you know about these differences in creativity, and is this something you're gonna explore in your data sets?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that degrees of freedom are different in these different cases. So, in classical music, you are interpreting a score. So, you are performing a piece of work where a composer has decided the notes and they have written them out, and this is the what you get. So, it's almost like the content of what you play is determined. However, what is not determined is how exactly you interpret that. There's like many different interpretations you could have of this like exact same music. The way one piano player might play it could be completely different than another. So there's still quite a bit of room of creativity in the case of
Mm,
classical music. There is quite a bit of room there. However, like as soon as you get to jazz, all of a sudden you don't have a score anymore, so the notes are not predetermined anymore. So it's almost like you have a whole other realm of flexibility and melodic creativity because you can decide what you are going to play over some sort of structure. In jazz, usually you are improvising over some sort of structure, some sort of chord progression, which is usually like a jazz standard. Um, so yeah, there's so many more possibilities in terms
mm.
of melodic and rhythmic creativity that you don't just get to access as much in classical, unless you're improvising in a classical fashion, that is, which also exists as well.
Mm.
So there's different. It's just like different levels of creativity, I guess,
Mm.
and each genre has their own convention, I suppose.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had a conversation with a conductor, conductor a few episodes before, and they were talking about how it is the greatest creativity of the conductor comes in the interpretation, which comes down to the narrative delivery, the emotional delivery of the score. So they try to extract what's the composer really trying to say here emotionally and narratively, and that's how they guide their interpretation for the whole orchestra, for the whole music ensemble. Um, in the case of jazz improvisation, the creativity we could imagine that because there's no conductor could completely derail the group performance, that the musical ensemble would not be as much connected, or do you think there's more non-verbal communication because okay, it's now your turn to do a solo, okay, good, let's come back to the
Yeah.
melody. How does it differ in improvisation in a group setting, do you think?
Definitely, they have to be relying on nonverbal communication. So a conductor would be like a clear leader that is dictating and deciding and kind of leading everyone. That doesn't exist in a small jazz ensemble when they are improvising together. They have to rely completely on themselves to negotiate, like when it is, one person's turn to improvise while the others support, and then when that role gets passed off to the next, like they're negotiating all of that in real time, well, a lot of it is nonverbal.
Mhm.
So that's very cool. It's like the real time negotiation. You can watch it if you watch jazz musicians, like especially if they're like doing like free improvisation. There's a lot that's going on. They're constantly interacting, and you can see it non-verbally.
Interesting. Wow, maybe your next data set.
Yes.
Well, Emily, it has been a pleasure to have a conversation with you. Um, for our audiences and listeners, do you have any takeaways that you'd like the audience to know?
Yeah. Well, I just think we might take maybe just appreciate movements. Next time you're out at a concert, maybe pay special attention into like how the performer is moving, because those movements are actually like so powerful and they convey so much information. They reveal how the performer is feeling. They reveal how the performer intends to play, like their interpretation of the piece. And depending on what kind of concert it is, I think you as an audience can also affect the performer's movements as well. So just realizing how powerful movements are, how cool movements are, I think is my takeaway.
That's amazing. And just on a last point on that conductor who had a chat, he mentioned that the best conductors do not necessarily have exaggerated movements. And he says, well, if they're too exaggerated, it can distract the audience. But here you're not saying distract yourself with the movements, just notice the movements, which could be very subtle and conveying a lot of information, as you've just said.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, Emily, it has been a pleasure to have you here on the podcast called Health, Vengeance and Harmonies, inspired by René Girard. And if people want to learn more about you, you have your Instagram that they can get in contact with you. And this, you mentioned that you are managing also the LiveLab.
Yeah, it's the LiveLab Instagram, the great one.
Instagram.
They'll post all the cool studies we do.
Very cool. And this is your Google Scholar for anyone who wants to read in more detail your studies.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And we'll have a chat very soon.
Thanks so much for having me.